Alphonse Gabriel Capone was born in 1899 in the heart of Brooklyn, the son of Italian immigrants who dreamed of the American dream, but could never have imagined that their child would become America's most famous criminal. From the violent streets of New York to the speakeasies of Chicago, Al Capone built a crime empire that defied prohibition itself, earning the title of the United States public enemy number one. His meteoric rise to power coincided perfectly with the Prohibition era, when America decided to outlaw alcohol and inadvertently created the perfect opportunity for an ambitious young man from Brooklyn to become Chicago's uncrowned king. What began as small jobs for local gangs quickly evolved into a sophisticated criminal empire controlling everything from bootlegging operations to gambling dens, brothels, and protection rackets. Capone was not merely a criminal, he was a visionary entrepreneur who understood that organized crime required structure, discipline, and, above all, flawless public relations. While he ordered brutal executions of rivals, he also handed out soup to the poor during the Great Depression, crafting a paradoxical image that fascinated the nation: the gentle gangster, the criminal with a code of honor. But every empire has its downfall, and Capone's came not from rival bullets or street violence, but from the most mundane weapon imaginable: tax evasion. The man who had evaded hundreds of homicide charges was finally brought down for failing to pay his taxes, proving that even the most powerful criminal is not above the law. His story represents not only the biography of a man, but the portrait of an era: the Roaring Twenties, Prohibition, and the birth of modern American organized crime. The Brooklyn of 1899 pulsed with the energy of thousands of immigrants arriving daily in America, each carrying dreams of prosperity and fears of failure. It was in this cultural melting pot that Alphonse Gabriel Capone was born on January 17th, in a modest house on Navy Street. His parents, Gabriele and Teresa Capone, had arrived from Italy only a few years earlier, bringing with them the traditions of Angri, a small town near Naples, and an iron will to build a better life for their children. Gabriele worked as a barber, his deft hands wielding a razor to support a family that was growing quickly. Teresa, a strong and determined woman, ran the household and cared for her children with the rigid discipline typical of Italian matriarchs. Little Alphonse, soon to be known as Al, was the fourth of 9 children, a position that taught him early both to fight for attention and to hold his own against older siblings. How did growing up in an Italian immigrant family shape the future of America's most famous gangster? Read on to discover the origins of Al Capone's lethal charisma. The streets of turn-of-the-century Brooklyn were a university of urban survival. Al quickly learned that physical strength and street smarts were more valuable than any formal education. By age 6, he already displayed a magnetic personality that drew other boys to him, forming small neighborhood gangs whose early exploits amounted to playground turf wars and petty candy thefts. Al's formal schooling ended abruptly at 14, when he attacked a teacher who had publicly humiliated him. This seemingly minor incident marked the moment when Al Capone definitively chose the streets over the classroom. Gabriele tried to discipline his rebellious son, but Al had grown beyond paternal control, physically imposing for his age and already exhibiting the dominant personality that would make him famous. That act of defiance at school was the first sign of the explosive temper that would define Capone's criminal career. But how did he channel that destructive energy into something productive? It was on the streets of Brooklyn that Al had his first contact with figures who would shape his future. Johnny Torrio, a low-level Italian with big ambitions, ran several businesses in the neighborhood: bookmaking operations, loan sharking, and protection rackets for local merchants. Torrio noticed young Capone not for his brawn, but for his natural leadership ability and instinctive grasp that crime could be run like any other enterprise. Al's first job was as a collections agent for Torrio, visiting merchants behind on their protection payments. By 15, Al had learned that violence was only a tool, and that the threat of violence, wielded with intelligence and perfect timing, was often more effective than violence itself. This lesson would become fundamental to his criminal philosophy. Those early lessons in psychology and intimidation would form the bedrock of Capone's empire. But first he needed to learn the brutal rules of New York's underworld. During his teenage years, Al worked in various establishments that served as fronts for criminal operations. It was in one of these places, a social club in the Lower East Side, that he received the 3 facial scars that would accompany him for the rest of his life. A fight over a woman ended with Al being slashed by a razor, marking him permanently and teaching him a valuable lesson about controlling his temper in delicate situations. The scars, ironically, enhanced his street charisma. Rather than hiding them, Al displayed them like medals of honor, proof that he had paid his blood price in the criminal world. Newspapers would later dub him Scarface, but those who knew him personally never dared use that nickname in his presence. They had learned that behind the easy smile and charming manners lay a man capable of extreme violence when provoked. The scars became part of Capone's legend, but how did he transform this mark of humiliation into a symbol of power? In 1919, Chicago boiled over with opportunities that New York couldn't offer. The city, already notorious for its endemic political corruption and anything-goes atmosphere, was on the verge of becoming the epicenter of a criminal revolution once Prohibition took effect. Johnny Torrio, who had moved to Chicago years earlier, sent the telegram that would change American history. "Al, I need you here. A great opportunity awaits us." Al Capone arrived in Chicago at age 20, a young man still technically inexperienced, but already hardened by Brooklyn's streets and schooled in the basics of organized crime. Chicago greeted him as a lover greets a new partner, with seductive promises and hidden dangers. The city pulsed with industrial energy, immigrants from dozens of nations, and a political elite that had learned to turn a blind eye to certain activities in exchange for proper compensation. 20s Chicago was a place where corruption and ambition danced together. How did Al Capone not only survive but thrive in such an environment? Torrio had built a sophisticated enterprise centered on his establishment, the Four Deuces, which served simultaneously as a gambling den, brothel, speakeasy, and criminal headquarters. Al began as something like an operations manager, but Torrio soon realized that his protege possessed talents far beyond mere execution of orders. Al showed a natural grasp of logistics, personnel management, and, most importantly, public relations. Al's first major innovation was to transform how the organization interacted with the local community. While other criminals relied purely on intimidation, Al introduced the concept of community services. His organization began providing genuine protection for small merchants, settling neighborhood disputes, and even offering reasonably priced loans to struggling families. It was organized crime with a human face. This revolutionary approach made Capone something unique, a criminal beloved by the people. But how did he balance public benevolence with the brutality his business demanded? Prohibition, which took effect in January 1920, was the God-given gift Al Capone didn't know he was waiting for. Overnight, America had made one of its most popular pastimes, drinking alcohol, illegal. For a man with business acumen and underworld contacts, this was the business opportunity of the century. Al immediately understood that they weren't just selling liquor. They were selling rebellion, sophistication, and the thrill of breaking the law. Al's first directly controlled speakeasy was a modest South Side bar, but he ran it with the precision of a luxury hotel: quality liquor, live music, discreet yet effective security, and an atmosphere that made customers feel special for taking part in this conspiracy against official morality. Within 6 months, Al had expanded to 5 venues, each generating profits that outstripped any comparable legitimate business. But the initial success in speakeasies was only the beginning. How did Al transform a local operation into an empire that would control all of Chicago? Violence was inevitable in this new world of unlimited opportunity and fierce competition. Rival gangs of different ethnicities, Ireland's, Poland's, Italy's, fought for control of lucrative territories. Al faced his first real test when Dion O'Banion's gang tried to encroach on the South Side turf held by Torrio and Capone. Al's response was calculated and brutal. Instead of an all-out war, he orchestrated a series of precise strikes that eliminated the rival leadership without unnecessary losses among foot soldiers. That campaign cemented Al's reputation as a military strategist applying principles of war to criminal enterprise. He studied his opponents like a general studies terrain, identifying weak points, unstable alliances, and opportunities to divide and conquer. By age 22, Al Capone had become a force all of Chicago had to reckon with. The combination of strategic intelligence and ruthless efficiency made Al a legend on Chicago's streets. But how did he maintain control over an ever-expanding empire? The decisive moment came in 1925, when Johnny Torrio was gravely wounded in an assassination attempt and decided to retire, handing complete control of the organization to Al Capone. At 26, Al had become the most powerful man in Chicago's underworld, overseeing a network that included hundreds of speakeasies, multiple distilleries, gambling houses, brothels, and a payroll that counted police officers, judges, and politicians of every rank among its beneficiaries. The Al Capone of 1925 was unrecognizable compared to the young man who had arrived from Brooklyn 6 years earlier. Clad in bespoke suits that cost more than a common laborer's annual wage, driving armored Cadillacs, and maintaining luxurious residences, he had become the very definition of the American success story, with the small caveat that his primary business was entirely illegal. But to Al, that was merely an annoying technicality. He saw himself as an entrepreneur serving a market demand that the government had mistakenly tried to suppress. At its peak, the Capone empire was a business operation of impressive complexity. Al had established a clear hierarchy, inspired both by legitimate corporate structures and Sicilian mafia traditions. He appointed vice presidents for each division: liquor, gambling, prostitution, protection, each reporting directly to him in weekly meetings that resembled the boardrooms of any major American corporation. How did Al manage to turn chaotic criminal ventures into an efficient commercial machine? The answer reveals the organizational genius behind the brutality. Al's brightest innovation was the creation of a criminal public relations department. He hired journalists, photographers, and even speechwriters to cultivate his public image. While ordering the execution of rivals, he also organized food distributions for impoverished families during the Great Depression. When newspapers portrayed him as a monster, Al countered with charity events that cast him as a modern Robin Hood. The strategy worked because Al genuinely believed his own narrative. To him, there was no contradiction between eliminating a rival who threatened his business and donating thousands of dollars to orphanages. Both were simply necessary business decisions to maintain and expand his operations. This rationalization allowed Al to keep a clear conscience while building one of the most violent criminal empires in American history. This duality between brutality and benevolence made Al Capone a unique figure in organized crime. But how did he handle the psychological pressures of maintaining this split persona? The most sophisticated aspect of the Capone empire was its intelligence and security apparatus. Al had built a network of informants ranging from clerks in government offices to the mistresses of prominent politicians. He learned of police investigations before they were officially sanctioned, received copies of legal documents before they reached the courts, and had advance warning of any attempts to infiltrate his operations. This intelligence network was complemented by a personal security department that made Al one of the most protected men in America. His bodyguards were former police officers and soldiers trained not only in combat but in threat detection, escape routes, and even medical first aid. Al rarely moved without at least 4 armed men and never slept in the same place 2 nights in a row. Al's paranoia was justified. He had more enemies than most heads of state. How did this life of constant vigilance affect his personality and relationships? Al's relationship with his family revealed yet another facet of his complex character. He had married May Josephine Coughlin in 1918, and she had given him a son, Albert Francis "Sonny" Capone. To Al, his family represented a tie to the normalcy and legitimacy he secretly craved. He kept May and Sonny completely isolated from his criminal enterprises, creating an absolute division between Al Capone the gangster and Al Capone the husband and father. This compartmentalization was essential for Al's mental health. At home, he could pretend to be just a successful businessman in import and distribution. May, smart enough not to ask inconvenient questions, played along, allowing Al to maintain the illusion that he was building something legitimate to leave to his son. Al's family life provided a refuge from the violence of his criminal operations, but it also created vulnerabilities his enemies wouldn't hesitate to exploit. Al's control over Chicago peaked in 1927, when he effectively dominated municipal elections through a combination of bribery, intimidation, and genuine popular support in certain neighborhoods. Mayor William Big Bill Thompson was essentially Al's employee, enacting policies that benefited the criminal underworld while preserving the facade of a legitimate government. This political influence allowed Al to operate with near total impunity. Police raids on his establishments were rare and always preceded by a tip-off, giving him time to clear out evidence. When arrests did occur, witnesses vanished, evidence mysteriously disappeared, and judges found technicalities to dismiss charges. By controlling both crime and politics, Al had created a state within a state. But that very absolute power was also laying the groundwork for his eventual downfall. February 14, 1929 dawned cold and foggy in Chicago, but no one could have predicted it would become a date that would forever define Al Capone's legacy. The St. Valentine's Day Massacre was not just another criminal event. It was the moment America decided that Al Capone had crossed every acceptable line, transforming him from a celebrity gangster into a public enemy who had to be eliminated at any cost. His rivalry with George "Bugs" Moran and the North Side Gang had grown dangerously intense in the preceding months. Moran had become more than a business competitor. He posed an existential threat to the empire Al had so carefully built. The Irishman was unpredictable, unnecessarily violent, and had begun forging alliances with smaller gangs in an attempt to surround and isolate Capone's organization. The decision to eliminate Moran and his leadership once and for all must have seemed logical in Al's mind. How could he have known that this choice would destroy everything he'd constructed? The plan was typical of the military precision Al had brought to organized crime. His men, disguised as policemen, would enter the warehouse on Clark Street, where Moran's gang regularly met, stage a routine raid, disarm everyone inside, and then execute them swiftly and efficiently. It was meant to be a surgical strike that would eliminate the rival leadership without leaving witnesses or evidence that could be traced back to Capone. The execution was nearly perfect. 7 men were killed in the warehouse, all associated with Moran's organization. The problem was that Bugs Moran himself was not present. A casual delay spared his life and left Al to face all the political fallout of a massacre without having eliminated his primary target. Worse still, the mechanical brutality of the crime shocked even an America accustomed to gang violence. The St. Valentine's Day Massacre was a tactical error that became a strategic disaster. How could a man so intelligent have so badly miscalculated the consequences? The press reaction was immediate and devastating. Papers that once portrayed Al as a colorful, even romantic figure now painted him as a bloodthirsty monster. The American public, which had tolerated and even admired his victimless crimes like bootlegging, could not accept the cold-blooded execution of 7 unarmed men. Al had crossed an invisible but unmistakable line between acceptable crime and intolerable barbarism. Political pressure on the federal government became unbearable. President Herbert Hoover, previously reluctant to deploy federal resources against local crime, publicly declared that Al Capone would be brought to justice by any means necessary. This presidential statement marked the start of a coordinated campaign involving multiple federal agencies, virtually unlimited resources, and a political will Capone had never before faced. When the federal government decided to destroy Al Capone, they marshaled resources no criminal organization could withstand. Yet Al still believed his web of corruption would protect him. The federal investigation was led by Elliot Ness and his untouchables, agents handpicked for their incorruptibility and dedication. Ness had studied Capone's operations meticulously and identified a crucial weakness. Despite all its sophistication, the Capone empire still relied on financial records to function, and those records could be used to prove tax evasion even when evidence of other crimes was lacking. Simultaneously, a parallel inquiry by the Internal Revenue Service began meticulously unraveling Al's finances. Frank J. Wilson, a Treasury agent with the persistence of a bloodhound, uncovered the classic mistake of many successful criminals. Capone had grown careless about seemingly mundane details like tax returns. The irony was delectable for his pursuers. The man who had escaped hundreds of murder charges would be brought down for failing to pay his taxes. The pressures of the federal probe began to affect Al in ways he hadn't anticipated. Political allies who had once seemed reliable started publicly distancing themselves. Police officers and judges on his payroll began refusing bribes, fearing that association with Capone now carried unacceptable political risk. More disturbing for Al was the gradual erosion of his own organization. Loyal lieutenants began exploring deals with the federal authorities, calculating that the Capone era was ending and their own survival depended on switching sides before it was too late. Al, who had built his career on mutual loyalty and trust, now found himself surrounded by paranoia and potential betrayal. The empire Capone had built on loyalty was fragmenting under federal pressure. How would the most powerful man in Chicago react when he felt his control slipping through his fingers? In October 1931, Al Capone sat in the defendant's chair in a federal courtroom in Chicago, wearing one of his bespoke suits. But for the first time in years, his characteristic confidence had been replaced by barely hidden anxiety. The man who had controlled an entire city now faced 11 counts of tax evasion, each carrying years in prison that could effectively end his criminal career forever. The trial was an unprecedented media spectacle. Hundreds of journalists from across the country descended on Chicago, turning the federal courthouse into a circus where the main clown was Al himself. He had tried to bribe the entire jury, a last-ditch effort to deploy the tactics that had worked for over a decade, but the judge uncovered the scheme and replaced every juror at the last minute. For the first time in his criminal career, Al Capone confronted a system he could neither corrupt nor intimidate. How did the most powerful man in Chicago react upon realizing that his power had limits? The defense's strategy was simple. Portray Al as merely a businessman running entertainment venues with any illegal activity carried out by subordinates without his knowledge. But the prosecution had amassed meticulous financial records showing cash flows far beyond any legitimate income, and witnesses who detailed exactly how Al personally oversaw every aspect of his operations. The trial's most dramatic moment came when Frank J. Wilson, the federal accountant, presented records showing that Al had spent over $165,000 on clothes and jewelry in a single year, an astronomical sum at the time, while reporting official earnings of only a few $1,000s. The contradiction was so glaring that even Al appeared embarrassed as the figures were read aloud. Seeing his financial extravagance exposed publicly was humiliating for Al, but worse still was realizing he had been undone by his own arrogance. On October 17, 1931, after just 8 hours of deliberation, the jury found Al Capone guilty on 5 of the 11 tax evasion counts. Judge James Herbert Wilkerson sentenced him to 11 years in prison, fined him $50,000, and ordered $30,000 in court costs. For a 32-year-old man who had planned to expand his empire for decades, this sentence was effectively a death sentence for his criminal career. Al's first stop was the Atlanta Penitentiary, where he initially tried to recreate the luxury and influence he'd enjoyed in freedom. Using smuggled funds, he turned his cell into an improvised suite, complete with carpet, wood furniture, and even a radio. More troubling for the authorities, Al began exerting influence over other inmates and even some guards, recreating a smaller version of his criminal organization inside the prison. Even behind bars, Al couldn't abandon his instincts for control and organization. But the federal authorities had other plans to break his power for good. In August 1934, Al was transferred to Alcatraz, the new maximum security federal prison on an island in San Francisco Bay. Alcatraz had been specifically designed for inmates like Al, criminals with resources, influence, and a history of corrupting conventional prison systems. On the Rock, as it was known, Al discovered that all the money in the world couldn't buy special privileges. Life at Alcatraz was a brutal shock to a man used to luxury and deference. Al was treated exactly like any other prisoner. Same institutional food, same mandatory work details. More devastating psychologically was the complete isolation from the outside world. On Alcatraz, Al was not the powerful Capone, but merely prisoner number 85. The isolation and strict routine of Alcatraz began to affect Al's mind in ways that years of gang wars never had. During his years at Alcatraz, Al started exhibiting signs of mental deterioration that prison doctors initially attributed to stress and depression, but it gradually became clear that something far more serious was at work. Al, who had always been meticulously careful about his appearance and conduct, began experiencing episodes of confusion, memory lapses, and erratic behavior. The eventual diagnosis was advanced syphilis, a disease Al had contracted years earlier but never properly treated. The illness had progressed to its tertiary stage, attacking his nervous system and brain. Ironically, the man who had survived assassination attempts, gang wars, and the wrath of the federal government was being destroyed by a venereal disease he had ignored for years. Al's mental decline was perhaps crueler than any punishment his enemies could have devised. The Emperor of Chicago was becoming a shadow of his former self. Al was released from Alcatraz in January 1939, but the man who emerged from prison was unrecognizable compared to the powerful gangster who had entered 8 years earlier. Physically frail, mentally confused, and utterly cut off from his former world, Al spent his final years in his Florida mansion, cared for by May and a team of nurses. On January 25, 1947, Al Capone died of a heart attack related to complications from syphilis at 48 years old. His funeral in Chicago drew thousands of onlookers, but few underworld figures. The era he had dominated was already history, replaced by new criminals who had learned as much from his mistakes as from his successes. Al Capone's death marked not only the end of a life, but the close of an entire chapter in American crime history. Yet his legacy would continue to influence both criminals and law enforcement for decades to come.